Here's my project piece I chose for the Ivy Lane Challenge. It's a beautiful Broyhill highboy with tons of details, but just some outdated refinishing style with these little spots and colors, just a little bit out of date, and I'm going to give it a makeover. It's beautiful on the inside, got these 3 smaller drawers for storage, and then these 2 larger drawers on the bottom. I have all the original hardware, which is super unique and gorgeous, so I'm really excited about that. First thing I'm going to do is get to work stripping off the old finish. I'm using this soy gel stripper to remove the finish, and I really love this product because it's non-toxic and safe to use indoors. So I just pour a small amount of what I need in a separate container, and I use a old paintbrush and I just start painting it on in a pretty thick layer. The trick is to get enough of the product on so that it really can start working well and lift up that old finish like you need it to, so it only takes 1 application to remove the finish instead of multiple. So I'm just making sure that I get a good amount of the product on the surface, and I'm gonna do every single part of this piece. So I'm just covering all the ledges and accents. Now I'm gonna put on my gloves because this is really messy, and I have this piece of cardboard and this plastic scraper to use and some paper towels. And I just start scraping off the product in an even fashion, and you can see that it works really, really well. And I only let it sit for like about 10 minutes because I got impatient, so this is what it looks like after only 10 minutes. So I'm gonna put a little bit more of the product back on those spots that you see that didn't quite come off. So that's why you want to wait like probably 20 to 30 minutes just to remove all the finish, so you don't need to do another application. But even though I only waited 10 minutes, it still worked really, really well. And I'm just gonna go right back over that spot with the product and put a little bit more on there, and then scrape it off again after like another 10 minutes or so. For the trim parts, I'm using this little brown square scraper with kind of rounded edges to get all the product removed from the trim and any edges. I also sometimes use a piece of plastic just cut in the right shape for whatever ledge, for whatever shape the ledge is. And that works really well too. So you just kind of find like an old piece of plastic or something that will fit into the shape of the trim that you have on your piece to remove it. So I try to get as much off as I can with the plastic piece, and then I wipe the rest off with a paper towel. So I try to get as much of the product and residue and old stain off as I can, but I am going to be cleaning it with soap and water after this. So don't worry if you can't get everything off, just get as much as possible off. So now I'm going to do the same thing on the rest of the piece. I just apply the product with a paintbrush, let it sit for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then scrape it off and wipe it with a paper towel. Now it's time to clean. So I literally just take my pieces outside and spray them off with a hose. And I have a water bucket full of Dawn dish soap and water, a couple squirts of Dawn dish soap and a lot of water. And I have this big scrub brush for all those crevices and details. And I just scrub away. This is the best way to remove all the product, all this, because the product is really sticky and gummy, and you want to make sure you get it out of all the corners and edges. So this is the best way that I've found, and you're only going to do this once, so it's totally fine if the wood gets wet. You just want to let it completely dry out before you start the refinishing process. So I usually do the cleaning one day and then I will start refinishing the next day as soon as it's dry. Once you're finished with the scrubbing, give it one last really good spray down and then let it dry for about at least 24 hours. Once it's completely dry, you're ready for sanding. So I'm using a square sander so that I can get into all the corners and edges, and I'm just using a 220 grit sandpaper. All I need to do for this piece is to lightly sand off any of the remaining stain that the stripper didn't remove. So I'm just doing a really light sanding. I'm just going over the piece nice and light, making sure that I get the rest of that stain off. If you don't have a square sander, you can also use an orbital sander. The only thing is you won't be able to get perfectly along the edges like you can with a square sander. But you can still get the majority of the piece. And then you can just take a piece of 220 grit sandpaper, fold it around a sanding block, and then get into the edges and corners with that. Obviously, it takes a little bit of muscle, but it's really not bad, especially if you got most of the finish off with the stripper. It really won't take that much longer to sand the corners. So for this project, I'm using the Real Milk paint in the shade Boardwalk. This is a powdered paint, so you're going to mix it up before you use it. So I'm doing a paint wash on this piece. So I'm going to use about twice the amount of water as I do paint. So I put in about 3 scoops of paint. So I'm going to do like 6 to 8 scoops of water to just water it down a little bit. Once you've added the paint and water, you want to give it a good mix with a stick, and then you're going to tightly close up the lid. Oh, I almost forgot. Make sure that little marble that comes inside the container goes back in there for mixing purposes. Take a hammer and close the lid really tight, and then you're going to shake it and mix it for 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, you're going to let it sit for about 20 minutes and then open it back up and it's ready for use. So it's going to look pretty foamy like this, and you just take your paintbrush and give it a quick mix and the foam bubbles kind of like die down a little bit. So before you start painting, make sure that you have completely wiped down your piece with a microfiber cloth and remove all the dust and debris. I'm using my 2-inch zebra brush for this project, and for a paint wash, you just paint it on just like normal. You have a lot of extra time to kind of get it on the way that you want because it is so watery, so you have tons of time to work with. And depending on the finish that you want, you can either let it soak in or you can wipe it off. For this piece, I'm going to just let it soak in because I love the way that it looks. I like the color that it dries to, and I think it's just like the perfect neutral grayish shade. So I'm just going to get the paint on there nice and even, and then let it soak into the wood without wiping anything off. Okay. Yeah. 3:45. Is that Dad? Yeah. For the details of this piece, I'm doing the same thing. I'm using my paintbrush, and first I just wipe on a little bit of paint on the outside of the details, and then I'm going to take my paintbrush and try to like get it into the crevices and cracks in all the areas so that it looks uniform. I do want to keep the vintage antique look of this piece, especially with these details here. So I did leave a little bit of the dark finish inside the detailed parts, just so it kind of keeps that antique look. And also that creates a really nice dimension in these areas, which gives it, which keeps that antique look. So I just get the paint on as good as I can, and then I let it dry. If there's any drips, I'm just taking this little paintbrush and kind of smoothing those out so that there's no drips or blobs on the inside. Doing a paint wash like this is really user-friendly because it's, you know, it's more thin and watery, so you really aren't going to get the drips and streaks that you would with thick paint. Once that paint wash has dried for about 24 hours, I apply the top coat. I'm using a water-based polyurethane in a satin finish. Open it up and give it a really good stir, and then I use this foam brush to kind of wipe it on, and I just wipe it on nice and smooth. I kind of use an overlapping method, so after I've wiped on one area, I overlap a little bit, just so that there's always that wet edge, so one part doesn't dry quicker than the other. I also like using these foam brushes because they have a nice little pointy edge so you can get into the crevices on your trim. If you're not doing the entire piece at once and you have to take a break, just put your foam pad in a Ziploc bag and seal it up, and that'll keep it nice until you're ready to start again. I'm on the final details, and I'm going to be adding a beautiful liner to the back and the insides of this piece. So to do that, you just want to measure your space wherever you're going to put the liner. Just measure that to get the measurements for the liner. Once you've gotten your measurements, open up your liner, and I always write the measurements right there on the inside just so that I can look at it while I measure so I don't forget. Then I usually use like these two just scrap pieces of wood, and I put one on each side so that the paper will stay flat while I'm measuring. I just spread it out as much as I need it so that I'm all ready for measuring. Now all I have to do is mark out my measurements on the bottom side of the liner, And a quick note, I always try to get the liner like this that has this grid on the inside because it makes it so much easier to cut in a straight line when you have this. So that's one thing that I always look for when I'm looking for a good liner. When you're installing the liner, you need something smooth and flat that you can use to smooth out the bubbles with. So I use this little piece of scrap wood to do that. I usually start with the top corners and I just put them in as best as I can and then flatten down the rest of the liner and then use this little wooden piece to smooth out the bubbles. If you have any excess, you can use a paper cutter to trim off the extra. So I just carefully press the blade into the corner and I cut off that excess part of the liner very, very carefully. And then I just peel away the excess and I have a perfect line. You do want to be really careful with this part because it's super easy to just accidentally cut a little bit too much with this knife. So just be really careful when you're doing it so that you don't have to restart. Now I'm going to line the drawers using the same method. So I just measure and then I go cut my piece of liner. I carefully pull off the back. You want to be really careful because some liners are kind of thin and they tear really easily. So just carefully peel off the back, and then I usually start with the back corners and I just take the two edges of the liner and I try to place it in there as carefully as I can. Then I take my wooden piece and I smooth out all the bubbles, kind of going from the middle to the edges until it's nice and smooth. Now the last thing I need to do is the fun part, which is just add the hardware back on. I've soaked and thoroughly cleaned the hardware using a few squirts of Dawn dish soap in some water and just scrubbing it with a little scrub brush until it's nice and clean. I didn't want to fully restore the brass color just because I really am going for that vintage look, and I want to keep this vintage brass hardware looking antique. And here's the final look. I'm just in love with this piece. I think it turned out exactly how I envisioned, and I really was just going for a more updated look. These pieces, especially these high boys, can look so dated in that old orange color, and I feel like this more modern neutral just really updated it into something that I can see in an everyday home. So if you like what you see, let me know, and stay tuned for the next flip. Thanks for watching.